Hello, good evening, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you for joining us as we discuss the fall 2025 special issue of the Centro Journal entitled Diasporic Puerto Rican Communities in Transformation. In this special issue, the authors examine the evolving nature of Puerto Rican diaspora communities across the United States, emphasizing that these communities are diverse, fluid, and shaped by ongoing connections to Puerto Rico. Drawing from multiple disciplines, the contributors explore how Puerto Ricans live, form identities, build communities in traditional destinations like New York, maturing hubs like Florida, as well as non-traditional destinations and virtual spaces. Today's discussion will be moderated by Delia Fernandez-Jones, who I'm excited to introduce to you. Delia Fernandez-Jones is the Associate Dean for Inclusive Access and Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Letters, Associate Professor of History, and a core faculty member of Chicano Latino Studies at Michigan State University. As a historian and scholar of Latinx studies, she has drawn on her lived experiences as a Latina in Michigan and extensive primary source research to document and theorize Latinx placemaking in the Midwest. She's the author of the award-winning book, Making the Mexican City, Mexican and Puerto Rican Migration, Activism, and Placemaking in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And she's proud to be one of the first 100 Chicanas to be awarded a PhD in history. Now to introduce our panelists. First, we have Janelle Ashley Vieira, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Colorado State University. Her research incorporates theoretical insights from sociology, Puerto Rican and Latino studies, and Black studies to examine changes over time to the US racial system due to the growth of the Latina population. Her current project investigates the processes of racial formation and racialization among diasporic Puerto Ricans living in distinct geographic contexts. Janelle received the 2025 Excellence in Teaching Award from Colorado State University's College of Liberal Arts for her innovative approaches to teaching courses on race, intersectionality, and research methods. Our next panelist, Mariel Quiñones Velez, is an art historian, curator, and cultural manager based in Puerto Rico. She pursued studies at the School of Architecture and the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus, and earned a master's degree in public administration from Universidad Ana G. Méndez. She has also completed professional certifications in collections management and curatorial practice through the American Alliance of Museums and the Latin American Institute of Museums. Since 2003, she is curator at the Museo de Arte Dr. Pio López Martínez at the University of Puerto Rico in Cayenne. Her work has focused on the research, exhibition design, and editing of publications and public programs centered on the work of early 20th century Puerto Rican artist, architect, and photographer, Ramon Frade Leon, as well as on Puerto Rican art with an emphasis on graphic arts and photography. Finally, we have Lisa Ortiz Guzman, who is an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, where she is also affiliate faculty in the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Urban Education program. She earned a PhD in Educational Policy Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and holds an MA and a BA from the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez campus. Born in Massachusetts, raised there and in Puerto Rico, and having lived for almost a decade in the Midwest, she has firsthand experience with her scholarly interests in critical intersections among Puerto Rican migration, rural regions, and education. Her book project examines labor practices, community formations, and knowledge making of migrants and kin living between rural Puerto Rico and the rural Midwest amid ongoing colonial conditions. Lisa's work has appeared in a number of different journals, including Centro and American Studies Journal. And so, without further ado, I want to turn it over to our moderator, Delia, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Simone. I think I just want to briefly mention that our wonderful host, Simone Dererme, is an associate professor of anthropology and the McMullen Associate Professor of Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi, and a co-editor along with myself and Elizabeth Aranda. So it's an honor to have some of our contributors here today to really think about together some of the issues that we were trying to foreground at this. But I think one of the ways to get us started is to have you all tell us a little bit about the piece that you have in this special issue. And why don't we start with Janelle, and then we'll go to Marielle, and then to Lisa. Everybody has about 5 minutes or so, just to give us an overview of your piece to help set the stage for our conversation.
Thank you, Delia. Hi, everyone. So I co-wrote a piece for this special issue with Dr. Vanessa Ribas, who couldn't be here today. So I'm going to kind of share what we worked on together. And our key question for this piece was centering Puerto Rican identity formation. So how are Puerto Rican identities shaped by place or like the context within which they're living? And basically, it was pretty cool that though we were working on two distinct projects on Boricuas, that Vanessa and I both did in-depth interviews and across three different, very distinct places with unique histories. So I had collected some interviews in New York City and in the Orlando area of Florida. And Vanessa had collected interviews in Southern California. So you can kind of see how New York kind of seen as the traditional destination for Puerto Ricans. Central Florida is kind of a more maturing destination, and the place with the largest number of Puerto Ricans now living in the States. And then Southern California being kind of one of those like non-traditional places where Puerto Ricans settled. So we had a really good setup to answer this question, and our interviews totaled 110, which is kind of I think there's a lot more to do. I think we've barely scratched the surface with this piece. But we were really trying to, within sociology, link two literatures that are very interrelated, but often have not been studied simultaneously. So the literature on migration or immigration and the literature on race. We saw that in these two literatures that scholars were talking about very similar things using different terminology. So migration scholars were talking about the importance of context of reception, and race scholars were talking about local racial formation. Essentially, if you combine these two ideas, it's basically asking questions about what is the environment like for migrants, that where they settle, how does it affect them? And if you add the race component, how is race locally lived and experienced? So we linked these two literatures, and we found that pretty much across place, Puerto Ricans were expressing a strong sense of pride in being Puerto Rican, which I guess for a lot of us isn't probably very surprising. But it was interesting to see the differences that they cited as central to how their identities, how they were forming their identities, and they were very context specific. So we found, for example, that the ethno-racial composition of each place, or thinking about which racial and ethnic communities they were living alongside, really impacted how they thought about themselves, racially and ethnically, in relation to others. And also state and local level, we called it political and cultural legacies. So thinking about how race shows up differently within different political contexts, essentially. So New York City and Southern California, right? Local and state level politics look very different right now than they do in Florida. And so kind of we were able to kind of show how Puerto Ricans were negotiating what that meant for them. And yeah, that's kind of like my overall summary. I think that this kind of really opens up a space to think further about the role of place and identity formation. And I think a lot more research can grow from this piece. So Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle. Marielle?
Hello, Delvia, Janelle, Lisa, and Simon. Hi, everyone. I have a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to share. You seen it? Yes. Okay. My article in this issue is entitled Desplazados de su tierra, trabajadores agrícolas migrantes puertorriqueños, serie fotográfica de Farrique Pesquera y recuento visual de una experiencia migratoria en dos épocas. In this essay, I explore Farrique Pesquera's photographic series as a valuable visual archive, understanding the migration of Puerto Rican agricultural workers to the United States. By bringing together two moments of his photographic production, 1981 and 2023, Pesquera presents a side-by-side view that highlights the historical continuity of the circular migration of Puerto Rican farm workers who leave the island for seasonal labor. I present this as the first photographic project to compare this experience across two distinct moments, one still shaped by the Puerto Rico farm labor program and another that comes after its dismantling. One of the main angles from which I study this work is the historical one. I see these photographs as part of a broader colonial and economic history. I read them in relation to Puerto Rico's colonial condition, to public policies that promoted migration as a response for rural unemployment, and the demand for farm labor in the United States. From this perspective, migration was not simply a personal decision. It was part of a larger structural process shaped by economic inequality, incomplete agrarian reform, industrialization, and colonial dependency. Pesquera images are important because they give visual form to historical processes that are often studied only through laws, statistics, or official documents. A second angle of my analysis is the aesthetic and documentary one. I show that Pesquera works from a humanist sensibility and within the tradition of the socially committed or concerned photographer, exemplified by figures such as Jack Delano and Frank Espada. His work does not only document labor in the fields, it also enters everyday spaces, gestures, expression, and moments of rest. He is especially interested in the frontal portrait. This is important because it creates closeness, empathy, and dignity. Through these images, agricultural workers do not appear as anonymous laborers. They appear as individuals with faces, emotions, and personal histories. This work presents migration as a deeply human experience. A third angle of my study is a comparison between two historical moments. When Pesquera places photographs from 1981 and 2023 in dialogue, I see both change and continuity. The contexts are different. Some labor conditions have changed. Even the visual language is not exactly the same. Yet what remains is a lasting structure of displacement, sacrifice, and family separation. In this sense, the series does more than show the passage of time. It also reveals the persistence of a historical wound. Another key angle in my essay is the intersectional reading of the migrant subject. I propose that these photographs bring together body, history, and territory. They show how colonialism, structural inequality, and social exclusion are written on workers' bodies through exhaustion, emotional distance, and vulnerability and resilience. Even when some portraits project strength or masculinity, I suggest that this strength is shaped by separation, fatigue, and fragility. This perspective broadens the study of migration beyond labor mobility alone and helps us understand its emotional, physical, and symbolic dimensions. The importance of Pesquera's photographic work for the study of Puerto Rican migration to the United States lies in several major contributions. It offers a valuable visual archive of a long and ongoing migratory experience. It expands historical and sociological scholarship by showing dimensions that written official records often fail to capture, such as dignity, sorrow, hope, adaptation, and survival. It also reminds us that Puerto Rican agricultural migration is not only a phenomenon of the past, but an ongoing reality. Finally, it led us to think about migration not as an isolated event, but as an enduring consequence of colonial relations and structural inequalities that continue to shape Puerto Rican life. Parique Pesquera's images function as memory, testimony, and critique. They help us see Puerto Rican agricultural workers in their full humanity. For that reason, I see this work as an essential contribution to a critical understanding of the history and ongoing transformation of Puerto Rican migration to the United States. I would like to thank Humanidades Puerto Rico and the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding my curatorial study of this Pesquera series and for supporting the exhibition of this work in Puerto Rico. I also extend my gratitude to CENTRO Journal for publishing this work with the selection of Pesquera's photograph.
Thank you so much, Mariel. I'm so happy you were able to show us the photos. These were really exciting to see, and the kind of editing process and all of the things that I'm looking forward to talking more about some of the aspects that you brought up there. And Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Janelle and Mariel. Those were great presentations. Hi, everyone. Again, I would like to start off by thanking Delia, Elizabeth, and Simone for your vision in putting together this special issue, the Journal and Centro for the support and the work of the team, everybody who helped on putting together this event, and Gustavo and Pedro for their editorial assistance. I would also like to thank, and I think this is important in terms of what the team did right on your end. I would like to thank the reviewers of my piece. The feedback that I received, especially around embracing aging, opened up conceptual possibilities that I had not considered. My essay is titled Aging in Puerto Rican Placekeeping as Feminist Praxis, and it centers on the experiences of three women, mothers of adult migrant children, who I am calling Breilín, Clorinda, and Doña Greta, who were grappling with the presence of migration in their lives, which is to say, not the generalized statement that everyone is leaving, but rather the everyday specific insistence from their children to move, and the woman's refusals to do so while also considering tangible possibilities of what other places offer. Through their stories, I focus on examples of living in Puerto Rico and laboring in the US, two themes that have long been a focus in Puerto Rican studies and in Puerto Rican feminist scholarship that I'm extending to the rural Midwest, which is part of a larger project on rural to rural migration between Jayuya, Puerto Rico, and Rantoul in central Illinois. The essay interrogates two grand narratives, or at least that I feel are two grand narratives, especially prevalent in news media. One, that everyone is leaving Puerto Rico, and two, that those who remain are all older adults. In doing so, I complicate these ideas by focusing on how the three women, who are all in middle age, do not entirely leave or stay, and how their decisions relate to a life stage seldom discussed, which is midlife. At the time we spoke, Breilín was 49, Doña Greta was 59, and Clorinda was 61. My focus then extends conversations about migration and aging in place through the lens of placekeeping. And I want to take the rest of my time to read from the article about how I'm conceptualizing this term. In placekeeping, home in Puerto Rico is not let go of, nor are the possibilities elsewhere that hold deep meaning. By locating placekeeping within the broader practice of placemaking, I observe it transpiring in the fluid moments of being, where one claims home and also another place where value is attached. Where keeping place in one region is possible, as is making place intimately in the other. Placekeeping differs from circular migration in that the former includes a sense of intimacy and personhood, qualities that are not quite present when referring to the broader phenomenon of circular migration with more formalized residence once away. Circular migration could transpire without space being transformed into place and without placemaking necessarily happening, but in placekeeping, these are vital. Puerto Rican placekeeping occurs within the confines of U.S. colonial citizenship. Thus, it is not a mere chance to travel back and forth, nor does it romanticize the struggle of living and laboring and all else in between as colonial subjects made vulnerable in numerous ways and places. If then placekeeping means holding on to home in Puerto Rico, which I see as an anti-colonial gesture, and also maintaining hopes of future possibilities in another place where value is attached via migration or other forms of connection, which I see as an inclusive gesture of diasporic futurity. And if people who placekeep make decisions based on their own desires, ways of knowing, being, and doing that is autonomous and counters familial and societal expectations, then Puerto Rican placekeeping is a feminist praxis. As such, it is grounded in Puerto Rican women of color and transnational feminisms that are attuned to how interconnected axes of power across regions affect people with intersectional lived experiences that are largely marginalized. Moreover, it is open to minute quotidian feminist acts just as much as the public insurgent ones, and includes people's contradictions and imperfections. Puerto Rican placekeeping refuses to lose the past, present, and future of Puerto Ricanness across places, and refuses to conform to normative assumptions about where and with whom to live. Importantly, it does not dismiss the worth of sustaining life through physical touch in person or via digital devices from a distance. We can see this right in Mariel's photo, for example, which oftentimes overlap, creating precisely the valued attachment to places. In the case of Brayling, Clorinda, and Doña Greta, there was a refusal of both forced displacement and of warm invitations to migrate, thus intentionally or not, a power play in which the mothers made the decisions to navigate between. Finally, placekeeping within the broader act of placemaking might seem unnecessary in Puerto Rico, especially if we think about the ways that placemaking has been conceptualized by several interdisciplinary scholars in the Latina Midwest, Delia inclusive. But at a time in Puerto Rico when settler colonialism is materializing quite obviously in the archipelago, it is ever more urgent to ask unnecessary for whom. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We are very excited to have a demographic that is so underrepresented included in your piece here and to be included in this special edition. So I move on to some questions that I have for all three. You can choose to answer, you can pass, whatever one you'd want. But I want to start with like this tiny teaser to the special edition, and it's in the intro. And you should know that Bad Bunny is in this piece. We couldn't make a special edition on migration, on diaspora without, at least mentioning Bad Bunny. And part of this was because while we were writing this piece, he had been announced as the Super Bowl singer, right? The Super Bowl performer for that. We were finished by the time the actual piece, or the actual Super Bowl happened, which I feel like we would have had to go back to the introduction, Simone, and look again for all the gems that he gave us there. But one of the things that we pointed out was, or in our introduction, is just this persistent unbelonging of Puerto Ricans and the amount of labor that everybody had engaged in to be like, he's a citizen, this is a part of the United States, all of the various ways to kind of claim belonging for Bad Bunny and for Puerto Ricans in general. And so my question is that there's like a persistent unbelonging is one of the major themes that we're looking at, right, in this special issue. But are there other major themes that your pieces are pointing to regarding migration and diaspora? You're free to talk about any major theme that you are seeing in your work or this unbelonging. What are the ways that the field has really changed or has not in regarding these ideas of migration and diaspora?
I can start if that's okay. I've been thinking a lot this year in a way that I hadn't previously about relationality, which I will say I learned a great deal from some folks at Centro. I know our directora is very big on the concept of relationality, but I'm really seeing it as a theme after hearing all of our presentations and our pieces. When we're thinking about studying Puerto Ricans in terms of migration, the diaspora, the folks still in the archipelago, I think about how my interviews in particular were restricted to the states simply due to resource limitation. But even with that being said, I there the ways Puerto Ricans are thinking about themselves in terms of their identities still there is a relation back to Puerto Rico, and perhaps it is due to the fact that there's constant movement back and forth. I think also something that hasn't changed, and I think you've alluded to it already, is like how our colonial condition continues to shape, right, our movements and how we keep defining, redefining like who we are as a people. So yeah, I'm seeing like there's a very kind of relational element across our pieces.
Yeah, I would add, so my work is intentionally honoring or attempting to honor both lived experiences in Puerto Rico and lived experiences in the US, in the relational ways that they transpire, as you mentioned, Janelle. And I believe, right, that the study of each on its own term is important. And I think it provides a lot. Um, much like the foundational work in the field has shown. And I also agree that considering migration alongside diasporas offers fruitful additions to our understanding of Puerto Rican studies. Siempre y cuando, I think, right, that we do not seek to collapse these processes as one and the same, in which I appreciate how in the journal, right, I was able to read the intro at least, and even in the call, there wasn't an intention to collapse these two. And I would just add that, part of what I try to do is make visible that beyond much of the public rhetoric that I've witnessed many times where it appears divisive between communities here and there, that's not what showed up with the woman that I spoke with, or even like the larger project, right? And this was mainly because people understood the structural nature of migration. And so I'll stop there, but I do agree with the relational and treating both concepts and places distinctly, but also together as well.
Right. Okay, I'll go to my next question was actually about this, about the relationship between between those living in Puerto Rico and those in the diaspora. And I think Janelle, you really anticipated what I was thinking in terms of our wonderful directora who is helping in that intellectual vision on understanding one another. And I think part of what we included in the introduction is a wonderful quote from her about about Bad Bunny and the concert series in Puerto Rico, about what this does to kind of offer a moment of healing, often offer a moment of connection, of seeing one another. And part of what we wanted to do was explore like what were or at least surface, right? What are these things that are keeping us apart in a way that makes it that we need to connect again. I don't know if you want to comment on any of those. I think you said some of those things, but if there's anything else you wanted to say about that, I would welcome that here, or I can go to the next question. All right, go to the next one then. Great. Can you all talk a little bit about place and region? Because you're in kind of three distinct places across, the mainland, the continental United States. So what is the role of place and region and the ways that you are looking at the communities that you're studying?
I can offer it's pretty much central to our work. Especially thinking about, you know, even compared to like several decades ago to now, how much more dispersed the Puerto Rican population is, the diasporic population. Um, just thinking about what how do those local contextual factors really shape how we are thinking about ourselves in relation to others. And I think, I think about kind of why I was like been thinking about why is this important to talk about now? I think especially as, we're kind of living in a moment that is this, I'll just say especially politically divisive. And thinking about like kind of like the future of the United States, the future of Puerto Rico, and all the discussions that are being had. I think it's really important to understand some of the kind of diverse perspectives that are coming from Puerto Ricans because of their living in different places and trying to I don't know, essentially establish a through line and try to, like, my vision is hopefully, like, in the long kind of term, build more coalitions for like positive change, Puerto Ricans, and other marginalized communities. So I think it's important to look at like specifically like what, how is place is impacting how folks are thinking about kind of some of these bigger issues. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Janelle, I'm going to follow up real quick. I'm just saying, can you say a little bit more about any distinctions that were emerging between what you found in these two locations?
yeah, so for New York and Florida, so I'm actually trying to tease this out in some work that I'm doing right now. So the there were conversations happening amongst New York Puerto Ricans about the relationship between Puerto Ricanidad and Blackness, specifically, that I didn't actually uncover in Central Florida, as an example. And I think that speaks to kind of that long history of, well, like African American and Puerto Rican communities in New York City living amongst one another, fighting for civil rights, et cetera. And those relations at times have been contentious, but also have been cooperative. And just kind of thinking about that migration history to New York and thinking about who primarily migrated originally, kind of like uh, working class Puerto Ricans. Also, yeah, trying to, I kind of see it as some resistance to some of the kind of Spanish derived versions of Puerto Rican identity that were coming from the island, kind of trying to establish a New Rican identity or trying to claim that happening there. In Florida, it's a little bit different. I think that geography plays a role there. I didn't necessarily see Puerto Rican communities having as much interaction with African American communities. They were often amongst themselves, living amongst some other Latino co-ethnic communities, but almost always adjacent to white communities. And so there was interesting conversations happening there about whiteness and who gets to claim it and who doesn't, et cetera. So Yeah, definitely the kind of composition of each place was impacting how folks were even talking about themselves racially in relation to others.
Ooh, that is going to be a lot to unpack, but it sounds like you're teasing it out, and I mean, Florida is complicated. It's always a place that I'm like, I've never seen a Mexican and Puerto Rican flag next to a Confederate flag all at the same time. And that is something that you can see in Central Florida and North Florida and a lot of parts. And so I'm really excited for the work that you're doing to kind of really get down to the bottom of this, especially in light of our political moment. Yes. Lisa or Marielle?
So I know, and my field of study is not necessarily migration, but I work with this series of photographs of migration of agricultural workers. They were they traveled to New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and I don't have the opportunity to talk with these people. The Fabrique did, and he did some videos recordings with these people, and it is important also to listen to these recordings. But these people are connected by their experience, like colonial subjects between Puerto Rico and the United States, the circular migration, and the places are the labor camps, the farms, the distance between home and the places where these workers labor. So this is a work there, it's a photographic work that not necessarily place means the location. It's like an emotional place in this work.
Absolutely, Mariela. And I think one of the things about these photos that struck me was that they were also so reminiscent of earlier photos that we have so few of, right? Of this, especially the post-World War II migration, also to the Northeast, but to the Midwest. And they were just breathtaking because I felt like I was seeing it was something that could move in time, and so many of these factors were the same. They reminded me of my family's migration to Michigan on farms in the 1950s. They're the photos that I wish we had of those first men who left to go on these fields, were by themselves, were among other men in Puerto Rico. And I think that you and Fabrique's work together and the photos and the analysis really show us that there's something about region, but there is something so connecting about this experience that there's probably similar photos that we would see across the Midwest in the type of work that Puerto Ricans were doing in Hawaii, that they have done in the Mountain West, that would look so similar. And that brings again that, right, the colonial subjectivity that these folks, possess at this time. So I really appreciate that too. And then the emotional place of longing. And I think there's such a rich area to look at. I know there's been some work on braceros, Mexican braceros, and that longing, right? I think of Ana Rosa's work on that, and there's so much about that is reminiscent, that fracturing of connection there, and then the ways that they're remaking connection with folks that they're migrating with. So thank you so much for bringing that element in. Lisa, we were talking about the Midwest, and I know many of the communities you're looking at might have those older connections back to the 50s, but they also might not. You want to talk a little bit about region?
Yes, so place and region are both central to my work. And Mariel, as I was hearing you and Janelle, also I was thinking, right, in terms of some of the non-traditional locations, right, Janelle, that you mentioned, but then Mariel also like these histories the reason or what brought me to my work originally was finding out about a Puerto Rican community 20 minutes away from where I was. And I had questions about why they were there and how they had arrived. And unsurprisingly, it was due to labor migration, and particularly factory work, that some then left and went to work in agriculture. And this is around 2007, right? It's not like in the 50s or 60s. So the people that I engage with have families. For instance, the husband of one of the women that I interview, I mentioned in the piece how he was proud to tell me that he had worked in Los Campos, right, in the past. And so there was definitely stories shared about everybody that I interviewed had some family member, right, who had some sort of experience with migration. Even though this community was relatively new and didn't have past family members in Central Illinois. So place and region are important for me. But also I want to make clear that one of my purposes with focusing in the rural is not, it doesn't follow a tradition of like seeing the rural as the place that needs to be fixed. And it also doesn't think about the rural in these sort of monolithic ways. The people who arrived to Rantoul, at least the ones that I spoke with, arrived to a Rantoul that it was a Black and brown Rantoul, like where they worked, who they were engaging with, were Black and brown community members, right? Like people in town and in the factories. And in many ways, it has remained that way. Not to say that they haven't engaged with like other folks of other ethnic and racial backgrounds, but this idea maybe that we have that everybody must be white in this rural area is just not the case in the research that I did. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do here with rural too, is to really think about to have folks not get turned off necessarily, right? When we think about rural and some of the characteristics, right, that we might think about when we think about these regions.
Lisa, I appreciate it so much because I'm a Midwest studies kind of scholar over here. And so I think there's one of the things that we do when we study these places are disrupt this powerful, powerful racial imaginary of the Midwest being the homeland, the Midwest being a place of that has nostalgia. I constantly hear that kind of theme when I'm engaging in Midwest spaces, that we're nostalgic. And the question is always nostalgic for what, right? Who gets to be nostalgic in the Midwest? And one of the things that you bring up is, right, this binary that's often like city is where people of color dwell, and urban is where white folks are. And that's never really been the case anywhere, right? Anywhere. But that also, tells us the powerful narratives about cities in urban space, right? And so I'm so excited that your work is taking this on and disrupting this. Okay, so I have, I think, one more question for those in our audience. If you can start putting questions for our panelists in the chat, that would be great. I can always ask more, but we'd love to hear from you too after this question. So I think what I would love to hear more about is gender, and obviously the intersectionality of it all. But gender, Marielle, you give us these. You and Fabrica together, right? Fabrica provides the photos, your analysis of these men, and what does it mean? And you gave us a little bit in your overview, right, about what masculinity looks like here. So if you could add any more for that, Janelle, I would love to know if in your interviews, 110 interviews is so many interviews. So what themes are emerging among women who've participated, right, in this? Lisa, you've talked so much about, right, the piece centers on this, right? Puerto Rican feminist theory and praxis. But I was wondering if you can share some of the stories of the women. I think they're really powerful in the ways that they're kind of navigating this back and forth and what is important to them. So if you have any short stories to share on that, I would love to hear it. So Whoever would like to start, I don't know if Maria, would you like to go first?
Okay, as you see, this is a series of photographs about men. Exclusively is that this experience was focused on men, the people who travel to do the labor in the agricultural camps were men. And women only travel like spouses or children of the family. But this experience with this man that Fahrique photographed, we can see them in his vulnerability, most of them with sadness maybe, but also in the strength of um, their experience to be a part of their families. And it's a difficult situation for these people. And in the 2023, Fahrique has a different experience with the men he photographed in the 1981. The 1981 men were more open to be photographed. But the 2023 were more I don't know how to say in English, distantes to be photographed by Fahrique. And there's some question about that how these men try to be more maybe to conserve his privacy or something like the man in the 1981 doesn't have. But it is interesting to see this photograph and compare the places they were photographed in the 81. In the 81, we have these photos of these men inside his dormitories. But in the 2023, these photos were practically impossible to take inside the dormitories of the men. So we can think about the differences of these.
Yeah, that's really interesting that they're dynamic, one with the photography, but then with the space. Also just, two things that come to mind are like post-pandemic, right? What does that look like for folks in terms of space and where their leisure time is held? And then it's so interesting when 1981, when this, I don't know, photography was not a novelty, but it certainly, the ways that we could take pictures on our phones and things like that is much different, right? And I'm wondering what role that plays, right, in their kind of distance from the camera. That's really interesting. Thank you.
So I'm glad you asked about gender. I'm working on some pieces right now. So this is like right on the forefront of my mind. We didn't explore any gender dynamics in the piece that we published with the special issue. But through my interviews, so of the 110, I did 58. So Vanessa did 52. So it just happened to add up to a really even number. I definitely noticed gendered racial dynamics throughout. So specifically a kind of gendered racialization happening to Puerto Rican women, specifically within the workforce being viewed as less capable, overly sexualized, and experiencing sexual harassment essentially at work. And then for many that reported like seeking to resist, right, by speaking up or seeking, some type of process through HR, whatever the thing that they did, being labeled as aggressive and undesirable to work with, essentially. So I kind of saw that across the board. I'm trying to figure out, there's something happening as well, intersecting, so race, gender, and place too, that I'm trying to untangle right now. I think amongst my Florida respondents, I noticed a lot more emphasis on sort of like amongst Puerto Rican women, kind of being viewed as less intelligent, especially when they had accents or when they were speaking Spanish in public places. And that being associated with some kind of undocumented status, so kind of association with illegal immigration. And so a lot of in my interviews, folks were talking about like, this is ridiculous. Like these people don't even know that we're Puerto Rican. Like, what do we mean? But anyway, that shouldn't matter, et cetera. So there's something that seems to me very context specific, given what we are aware of. There's many things happening in Florida right now politically around immigration. And then on the other end, actually, interestingly enough, there's a lot of reports. I'm calling it kind of like a racialized surveillance of Puerto Rican men, specifically in New York City. So whenever folks were talking about, the male respondents were talking about having experienced discrimination, it was always in public. It either had to do with unfortunate interactions with law enforcement, so racial profiling, and or just, being in a space like the subway and, seeing other people clutch their purses closer, or just treating, kind of like reading these Puerto Rican men as criminals. And they would talk about, and I'd have on like my suit to go to work, and I don't understand why people are like responding this way. So there's quite a lot going on. And so right now I'm trying to kind of break up a few papers to map quite what it is that I'm seeing, and then kind of go into like, okay, specifically within the context of each place, like, are there certain dynamics happening, and some more than others, and why that's the case. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Janelle. We are getting some questions in the chat, and I think some of what you're saying does attend to some of the questions about, the role of place, and let's see especially in Florida, the centrality. We have a question from Gustavo. Would Janelle be able to expand a bit on her findings in Florida because of the centrality concentration of Puerto Rican migration in the area today? How does she see that shifting more classical forms of Puerto Ricanidad? I think you touched on some of that, but that's one I'll come back to you for some more on that. Lisa, there's also a question that maybe I think you could combine it with what you're thinking now, but would love to hear more about placekeeping concept and what you said about how it contrasts with the prevailing circular migration idea. Not everybody is in the va-y-ven, and this feels like a direct, jab at that idea. So maybe I don't know if any of the stories you're thinking about, I had asked you about earlier, kind of can help to, elucidate some of that for us.
Sure. So I'll hold off on the jab. I hadn't considered it a jab, but I do have thoughts. I do have thoughts, right, on the nation on the move and who moves and all of that, which is part of the work that I cite and obviously build on, because I think it's been very important for my own thinking and trajectory. But yes, I think that's at the core of my piece, is to trouble the idea that everybody is leaving without giving it any nuance, and also that those who are staying are older adults who are not productive to society, right? That they're seen only as if like they're going to become a burden to Puerto Rico. And if you look at the newspapers, right, in Puerto Rico, digital, Inform, even you'll notice that. I'll come back to placekeeping in a second. One of the quotes that I pulled, Delia, when you asked me earlier. So for context, folks, part of what I try to do in this piece is show how the mothers are resisting, right? They're pushing back on their children and other family, mainly their children, on leaving Puerto Rico. So there's one section about living with migration in Puerto Rico and resisting. And so Doña Greta, her three children are living in the States, which interestingly, I read the special issue. One of her sons is a labor migrant in South Dakota, right? But we wouldn't get like the conceptualization of Diasporican yet, right? So the point about there not being Diasporicans in South Dakota will be interesting in the future, right? If these migrants decide to stay there. But to come back, she was refusing her children and also her husband. And so one of the things that she says, I'll read it in English so I don't mess up the interpretation settings. Or was it? I just found it. She is facing pressure from her husband, and she's elaborating what moving to a new place or a place new to them would entail. And she's joking that he's just crazy, right? That he's like going crazy. And says he was going to sell it all. He doesn't think. I told him it can't be like that because you don't know. How about if we don't like it? Where are we going to go? We don't have a place to return to. So he was just crazy. He wanted to leave. The kids would tell him that there were a lot of benefits there for him, and that is true. For him, yes. Over there, they help a lot. But my point is, who will drive us around? Micaela will be working, their daughter, and will be taking care of her kids. We aren't going to go to work. We aren't going to work with her too. And so I later expand on this idea that Doña Greta she wasn't trying to raise her grandchildren. Like she wasn't trying to move to take care of her children, to take care of her grandchildren, to live with her kids, right? That she really was thinking about her own desires of how she wanted to live in mid-age, right? And I think that that isn't discussed enough. I think that usually when we think about like the narrative of everybody's leaving, tend to think that, older parents will then automatically leave with their children to support them. And that wasn't the case with these three women. Another example, very briefly, from Clorinda, who was very involved with the church in Puerto Rico and in Rantoul, and is a key figure in thinking about the presence of religion, right? And in the piece, I talk about like, this is great. The church serves for many purposes, and it's also, something we have to take with caution because the ideas that maybe some of the people attending the church are not only conservative, but may become harmful, right? Depending on what they believe in terms of like Trump's administration. And so when she talked about leaving, when I asked her if she would leave, she based her answer on a religious calling and said, quote, "Let it be to serve God, not because I want to go because my daughters are there. I love, care for, and miss them, but I can travel and see them. But if it's for God's work, well, I wouldn't care to leave it all." And so to me, that's just fascinating, right? Because it really disrupts, I think, these ideas that we have of motherhood and of women where like they're trying to be there all the time any way they can. And these women are really thinking about their own life and what they want to prioritize. And Brayling, who's quote, I'm not gonna read for the sake of time, also engages in that, right? She actually thinks about distance and not proximity to her children to think about their futures and also her own independence.
Thank you so much, Misa, for sharing that. It's the stories of these women are really, really powerful and getting us to rethink things. So I'm so excited for others to be able to read that soon. So we have just a couple more minutes left, but we got some great questions in the chat. So I'm gonna hand them out and we'll give folks we'll go through them. So for Mariel, Gustavo was wondering, are there any other important contemporary photography projects or photographers who help us think about the social conditions of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora and the archipelago today? You mentioned Espada, but are there any other ones that you're thinking of that could help our audience think more about these things? I was also, let's see, there was also a question, this could be, I think, for Janelle, also maybe for Lisa, about what it means to to adapt to a new environment for these diasporic communities. How do they maintain cultural connections in those? And then language, if anybody's seeing themes of language in their work, You know, the going back to Bad Bunny, as Richard's question says, there was a lot of people upset that the show happened in Spanish. As a New Yorican who doesn't speak Spanish, I find that it's such a complex experience. You can't communicate with family, and just wondering, in addition to gender and race, where's language? If anybody has a comment for that. But why don't we start with Mariel?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Gustavo, for the question. I would highlight Centro's on both sides of the lens, documenting the Puerto Rican diaspora is a project that was created to document the last 5 of the Puerto Rican diasporic experience. It was 33 photographers from Puerto Rico and the diaspora. It's a great example of how photography is currently being used to think about migration, daily life, identity. In this project, we have names like Rubén Natal, San Miguel, Vania, J. Arroyo, Rina M. Santos, Mario Carrión, also we have Farique Pesquera, and the other photographer is Máximo Colón. That is also an important photographer. He has an exhibition titled A Storied Lens that presented photographs made over 50 years and emphasized his long commitment with social justice, activism, and the visibility of marginalized communities, especially in New York. So you can see centers on both sides of the lens. Is a good example for this.
Thank you, Mariela. I put the link in the chat for anybody who wants to look. Just a quick look in these photos are breathtaking. Thank you. Janelle?
I'm trying to figure out how to combine kind of answering 2 questions. So I'll start with the language. The language was a huge theme in my interviews that came up, and specifically as this participant kind of describes not speaking Spanish as a New Rican, that was essentially the primary way it came up in my interviews. So for Puerto Ricans who were raised in New York or Florida or somewhere in the States that either didn't speak Spanish at all or spoke very limited or less than proficient Spanish, they brought up a lot of instances where they had the authenticity of their Puerto Rican identity questioned by, I guess, more Spanish proficient speaking Puerto Ricans. And this was basically, it kind of brought to the center like the role of language and identity formation for Puerto Ricans and how that's very complicated, right? Given that like sometimes it seems that Spanish is used as a way to resist English language influence because the United States is the colonizer. So we're going to like kind of resist with using Spanish, but at the same time, that's complicated because now you also have you have a lot of folks from the diaspora growing up here that don't know that language. So then by kind of making like some unnamed rule about language and Spanish proficiency, now we're excluding aspects of the diaspora from who counts as part of the Puerto Rican community. So it gets very tangled very quickly. So I did note that. And I think where this definitely came up a lot in Florida. I know someone asked a question about Florida. Central Florida is very complicated. So I noticed kind of a convergence of several Puerto Rican groups. So primarily migrants from Puerto Rico, migrants from New York City and other northern places, and Florida born and raised Puerto Ricans. So with that kind of comes, I'm seeing a convergence of different and sometimes contradictory ideas about race. So, and then how that affects how we think about ourselves. So, Puerto Rican racial ideology, like myths about mestizaje, la gran familia puertorriqueña, and stuff like that. A lot of, anti-Blackness that comes with that. Then there's racial ideas that are kind of contradicting that a bit coming from New York and the North that tried at least, I don't know how successful all the time, but tried to center a bit more about, Blackness and the Taino, just tried to sideline a bit the Spanish kind of aspect of the identity to push back. And then there's also the Southern racial ideology that is very still black and white in terms of that racial binary. And so that others, Puerto Ricans. And so I just noticed a lot of this sort of just hanging in the air. And basically the question of who we are as Puerto Ricans, at least in that context, just the conclusion is not great right now, but my conclusion right now is that it's just in flux because of all these complicated factors and it's just ever evolving. So yeah, trying to cover two questions
I
there.
think you got it, Janelle, as best as we were gonna get it. So I'll turn the last one to Lisa if she has anything more to add. I know there was a second question that we didn't get to from one attendee about the event mentions increasing diversity within Puerto Rican communities. How does this internal diversity shape experiences of identity and belonging? I actually think Simone is going to get to some of that in her kind of final comments, and we'll tell you a little bit more about the major themes that we saw and the ways that diversity in terms of geography and all these other factors has really shaped some of these things. So Lisa, did you have anything?
I'll just say that, the challenges, what challenges Puerto Rican communities face when settling in newer destinations and how do they maintain cultural connections. I think, language is one of the challenges that came up also. In my larger project, I can see there was a church that was offering Spanish language, English language, and American Sign Language. And once the main white pastor left, and the Puerto Rican bilingual pastor stayed, the white community, ended up not returning to the church essentially, and they stopped ASL services, even though the Puerto Rican pastor was still offering bilingual services. So technically they could have stayed, right? So that comes up in terms of I think, disruption of the community that was forming across racial and ethnic lines. But I will say that one of the ways that the Puerto Ricans that I've worked with or, spoke with during this project, because they were about 2 hours south of Chicago, they relied a lot on historical placemaking in Chicago, right? And everything that we have benefited from, myself included, right? Living there for about 10 years, also 2 hours south of Chicago. So that was key in terms of food and, being able to find things that reminded them of La Patria. But one of the key things, and with this I'll end, was really holding on to what Mariel showed in that picture, right? Like the digital communication. I came across so many conversations. People were doing Facebook lives, like in rural, like Rantoul, to show like chillando goma, for example, like burning rubber, right? Just like as a pastime. And they're showing this to their family in Jayuya, right? And so the ways in which they were using a lot of digital options, digital devices to stay in touch and to maintain cultural connections, I think is something that is important and that we'll probably see more of, like the special issues already showcasing, right, in one of the other pieces.
Thank you so much for that, Lisa, and tying that back all together there. I'll hand it back to Simone, and Simone, you can take us out.
Yes. I mean, I first want to thank the moderator, Delia. Thank you. Our panelists and our audience. Those were wonderful questions. I put in chat a link if you're interested in purchasing the special issue. And as you can see from the conversation, with the special issue, we were seeking to expand how scholars understand Puerto Rican migration. We wanted to push beyond older frameworks to include digital spaces, intergenerational dynamics, transnational spaces, and underrepresented geographic areas. And across the case studies, that range from migrant labor to housing struggles, to museum representation and digital communities, this special issue highlights several key ideas. First, diasporic identity is not fixed. It's shaped by generation, migration histories, race, language, and place. Second, the political status of Puerto Rico continues to influence migration, inequality, and experiences of belonging. Third, place matters. Puerto Ricans experience race, citizenship, and identity differently, depending on where they settle. And a unifying theme is how Puerto Ricans in the diaspora assert visibility, resist marginalization, and create spaces of belonging through culture, activism, and community building. So this collection really comes at a particularly important historic moment due to several overlapping developments. Obviously, rising xenophobia and racial exclusion in the US, right? Contemporary cultural and political debates, such as backlash against Puerto Rican public figures, right, highlight the persistent misunderstandings about Puerto Rican citizenship and belonging, revealing that Puerto Ricans are still often treated as second-class citizens, right? We also have recent crises that are driving migration, major demographic shifts in the diaspora, and changing forms of community and identity, which makes the question, what does it mean to be Puerto Rican in the diaspora, especially pressing? So in conclusion, this special issue is both a reflection on current transformations and a call for new directions in research. It's timely because Puerto Rican diasporic life is being reshaped by crisis, migration, political tension, and cultural change, making it essential to rethink identity, belonging, and citizenship in light of these realities. And I am going to end there and we will close. And again, thank you all for joining us.